Shalom Bracha, welcome. We spoke on Sunday about Rav Henkin and his firm stance against Kiddush before Tkiyas and Rosh Hashanah. And we spoke a little bit about Rav Henkin's life, B'chlal. And in passing, we mentioned the relationship between Rav Moshe and Rav Henkin, who both lived in very close proximity to each other on the Lower East Side. And I figured I'll just, as like an addendum to Sunday's share, just go into a little bit of detail in that relationship. I can't say for sure, but I would think that such a dynamic duo like Rav Moshe and Rav Henkin, Paiskim who were roi and comfortable to paskin all throughout Daled Chelkei Shulchan Aruch, whose positions and pastures became, so to speak, law for generations that followed them, each one in their own way, in their own sugyas, is a chiddush to have two people of that ramah living in such close proximity to each other. And unfortunately, often, when two very great people live in close proximity and operate in the same space, oftentimes there's machlekes, sometimes severe machlekes, and etc. Now, what's interesting is that Rav Moshe and Rav Henkin had an extremely close relationship. From everything that we could tell, they held each other in tremendously high esteem. They loved each other. They were close to each other. Personally, in my family, my great-grandfather was the Balkaira for Rav Henkin in his house minyan. When Rav Henkin was old and couldn't see well and couldn't walk well, so he had a minyan in his house, and my great-grandfather was the Balkaira there. And eventually, when Rav Henkin was nifter, Rav Moshe, who was 14 years his junior, was also getting old, and they made a minyan in Rav Moshe's house, and he moved over there to become the Balkaira. And in my great-grandparents' apartment in the Lower East Side, the only picture that was there of Gedolim was a picture of Rav Moshe and Rav Henkin sitting together, as a Shalom Ahevu. These were the leaders, the leading lights of Klal Yisrael, were the leaders of that small community in the Lower East Side as well. Now, Rav Henkin in his Ksavim is much more limited. Rav Henkin didn't write as much, and therefore he quotes less of other people. But Rav Moshe, in his voluminous Igros Moshe, quotes Rav Henkin dozens of times, almost always l'shvach, and almost always that he agrees with him. Even if you look in the Hakdama to Gvur Salio from Rabbi Kleiman that we mentioned on Sunday, so over there's an article, a great monograph from Rav Henkin's great-grandson, Rav Eitan Henkin, who was actually Hashem Yom Kumdame, who was killed by a terrorist in a terrorist attack. But he over there in a monograph collects all the various locations where Rav Moshe quotes Rav Henkin, and you see the tremendous high esteem that Rav Moshe held Rav Henkin in. He quotes him. Sometimes he's medayik in his words even. He treats him with a great reverence. He almost will, on a shayla that Rav Henkin spoke on, Rav Moshe almost always will be deferential and agree with him and go with him. So this is a beautiful relationship. And Rav Moshe at some point in his life became like the president, the nasi of Ezra's Torah as well. Rav Henkin would send him sometimes to speak in various shuls or bungalow colonies or vacation spots to raise money for Ezra's Torah, and Rav Moshe would always go. Rav Henkin would go. Rav Moshe, by Rav Henkin's Levaya, said that Rav Henkin, in regards to Inyanei Tzedakah, had the Zehirus of an Amayra. The Gemaras sometimes have stories of the Amayra and their Chumras in regards to Inyanei Tzedakah. Rav Moshe said Rav Henkin was on that level. So there's a beautiful relationship between these two, Gedolim Chacham and Talmid Chacham, Paiskei Adar. Now, it's hard to say at what point Rav Moshe eclipsed Rav Henkin, but undeniably, at some point in time, Rav Moshe eclipsed Rav Henkin in his standing, his general standing, and his Kayach Apsak and etc. And l'chaira in 1959, 1960, 61, as the first few volumes of Igros Moshe were coming onto the market, and people were getting a whiff of the tremendous godless, the depth and breadth of Rav Moshe's ability to paskin and to access every chelik of Torah. So Rav Moshe's star was rising, and it began to eclipse Rav Henkin's, who was much older. Rav Henkin was close to 80 years old at that point. Maybe he was 80 already when the first volume of Igros Moshe came out. So Rav Henkin was a zaken Esfai Yamim, an old fixture of psak in America. And Rav Moshe, who was not that much younger than him, his star was on the rise, and he began to eclipse him in psak. How exactly Rav Moshe got the stellar of Pesach Adar, Gadol Adar? Actually, there's an interesting article in the New York Times from like the 1970s, and I think you could find it online, where the reporter discusses this with Rav Moshe himself, how one gets that job of Pesach Adar, and Rav Moshe tries to explain to him that Jews have questions, and when a person likes the answer, he refers his friend, and Chavre Islach, and over time it just becomes an address for Jews who need help, who need answers, and then that's how it becomes. And there's actually a few interesting articles in the secular newspapers of different psakim from Moshe. There's one from a famous shaila in the Philadelphia Gazette, I think, shaila of conjoined twins, one of the earliest shailas of Siamese twins that was discussed in the modern era. The whole, existence of Siamese twins is not so old. The Shus Yaakov, I think, is the first one to discuss it. Moshe, in a famous tshuva, a famous shaila, discussed children from a religious couple who were born in a hospital in Philadelphia. But in any case, at some point, undeniably, Moshe's star, rises to the point where he eclipses Rav Henkin, and he becomes known as the Paisik Hadar in a more enduring manner, not just of America, the Paisik of his whole generation and generations to follow. Whether or not, in certain Yanim, the Eilam Apsak agreed with Moshe Lamaisa or didn't agree with him, his point of view was always taken into consideration on an extremely high level, and that's the ultimate compliment, is the ubiquitousness of his psakim. You cannot avoid them. Now, in any case, what I really want to talk about is there's a few different shilas where Moshe and Rav Henkin did not see eye to eye. Some of them, in a less severe manner, but one of them in a very extreme outburst was a dramatic machlekes between Rav Henkin and Rav Moshe, to the point where Rav Henkin publicly came out and put out kol kaira, so to speak, denouncing Rav Moshe's psak. Rav Moshe stood by his psak in many tshuvas. Rav Moshe revisited this psak probably 10 times through Arigus Moshe and all the volumes of Ezer, stuck to it, even insisted at times that in certain elements of it Rav Henkin was maskim to him, and the machlekes was not as dramatic as people thought. By Rav Henkin's Levaya, where Rav Moshe was the first maspid, Rav Moshe mentioned this and said that even though him and Rav Henkin did not see eye to eye in this psak that we're about to discuss, it was always b'derech kavod, b'derech the way Talmidei Chacham argue with each other. And Rav Moshe said Vesvahav v'sufa, like the Gemara in Eruvin says that Talmidei Chacham, even though when they argue with each other, if it's done for the right reasons and it's l'shem shemayim, ultimately they become nasu oivim zelzeh, they become friends. And Rav Moshe said that him and Rav Henkin themselves were makayim this thing, that even though they had a vociferous machlekes about this inyan, esvahav v'sufa. So now, what is this machlekes that Rav Moshe and Rav Henkin, so vehemently argued about? It goes to a complicated Even Ezer shaila, one that I'm not going to go into in detail, but I'll just give the rough draft of the machlekes, and we could always revisit this at a later date. It's as follows: there's an earlier shaila that's handled by the Poskim in Europe already. The Dvar Avram has a long tshuva about it. The Achiezer has a tshuva about it. The Rogatchover talks about it. And that is the invention of civil marriage. Now, civil marriage was something new, because in Europe and in Islamic countries where Jews lived all the time, marriage was a religious institution, as it is still today in our communities, in Eretz Yisrael, Mashal. But marriage was a religious institution, and it always was religious. So therefore, Jews got married in religious ceremonies and Jewish ceremonies, and Christians and Catholics and Protestants and etc. got married in their own ceremonies. Now, what happened is that during the age of modernity in the 1800s, as great swaths of society became emancipated and they became less connected to their religions, the idea of civil marriage arose, where a marriage is just a contract between two consenting adults, and you don't need to have a priest or a minister or a rabbi officiate it and certify it. It's not up to them to give it. Marriage is civil. It's a contract. It's a marriage contract. Now, when that arose on the scene, there became the shaila, what about Jewish couples, a Jewish boy and a Jewish girl who get married to each other in a civil ceremony? They're not religious at all. And later on, they have a parting of ways, the marriage doesn't work out, and they disband, and the woman goes and gets married again. Obviously without a get, because there was never Kedushin, there was never Nesuin, this was never a marriage that was taken seriously from a halacha standpoint. She goes and gets married again, she has children. What is the status of those children? Are those children mamzerim? That's the most extreme, personification of the shaila. Obviously the shaila is, do you need to get b'chlal, and other nafkaminas, but the most extreme, way to perceive the shaila is, what is the status of the children from these women who get married again? Are they mamzerim? Are there now tens of thousands of new mamzerim in Klal Yisrael because of civil marriages? And the Poskim handled back and forth about this shaila, but ultimately the Dvar Avram and Rav Chaim Ozer, whose psak carried a lot of weight, were machriya that civil marriages do not have the status of a marriage, and therefore, although lechatchila one should try always to get a get for a couple from this situation, and one should try not to marry off someone from one of these relationships without a get, either because the man is violating Chaim Der Ben Gershon, or because the woman is Eshes Ish L'Shuk. But in the case where it's not possible to do that because one of the couple is not consenting, or you can't find them, or it's too difficult, Chaim Ozer, the Dvar Avram, and others, all machriya, or the Sridei Eish has a tshuva about it, that you could be samech that these marriages are not marriages at all, and therefore you don't need to get from them, and there is no major nafkamina. Now, what were they samech on? They were samech on the following. Now, the real issue over here was that there's a Gemara, several Gemaras that say that a person does not want his Be'ilas to be a Bias Nus, and therefore when he's living with a woman in a constant fashion, Gamro Makni, he uses the acts of their marriage to be kind to her and to consummate the marriage in an official manner. And we know the Mishnah in Kedushin says one of the ways to be kind to a woman, to do a Kedushin, is through Bia. So therefore, we're afraid that every marriage, if it goes on for too long, even for a little bit of time, if it's done in a formal, official capacity, it automatically, constitutes a marriage and it becomes a marriage. Now, there's a famous tshuva from the Rivash, in tshuva Vav, where the Rivash says a svara. He's talking about a couple who had been converted to Catholicism during the Tkufa of the Spanish Inquisition, the early Spanish transformation in the 1300s. And he talks about such a couple who gets married in a Catholic ceremony, not a Jewish ceremony, and then continues to live together for years and years, and then ultimately the marriage breaks up. And his question was, does such a couple considered like they were married according to Jewish law, or do we say not? And the Rivash is machadash a certain concept where he says, since this couple got married in a Christian ceremony, it's almost like the Lahedya were saying, we have no interest in Jewish marriage. We're not trying to shtaltzu to Jewish marriage in any sense of the word, and therefore, even though we're living together, we never mean to constitute and to consummate a Jewish marriage. Va'id, says the Rivash, they're living be'isr, from Isser Chamurim, Isser Kares, because the woman is not going to the mikveh, she's a nida, it's Isser Krisos. And if you see that they're not concerned about Isser Krisos, you're going to tell me that this is a person who's concerned that his be'ilah shouldn't be be'ilas nos. These are people that have no interest in anything related to Yiddishkeit and Judaism, and therefore their marriage is not a marriage according to the Torah. They never mean it to be consummated according to the Torah, and then even though they live together as husband and wife for a long time, it constitutes no marriage contract, and these people don't need to get. And the Shulchan Aruch, the Mechaber in Even Ezer, and the Ramah in Even Ezer in two different places, one in Simon Chavtes and one in Simon Kuftes Vav, I believe. The Mechaber and the Ramah both bring down this Rivash and Paskin like it Halacha L'maisa, that a marriage that's done outside the confines of Halacha, outside the confines of Jewish law, is not considered a marriage. It does not constitute a marriage. It does not matter how long this couple lives together. This is not a marriage and they don't need a get. Now, this is all good for establishing civil marriage, which means people who are not religious at all, who go and get married through the French court or the British court or the Austrian court or whatever it is, the courthouse marriage, where you could clearly say that they have no intention of shtelling zichzu to a Jewish marriage, and therefore even though they live together, it does not constitute a marriage. But the problem is, what happens when you come to reform or conservative ceremony? Now, a reform or conservative ceremony is a little more complicated, because there the people ostensibly are somewhat shtelling to what they believe to be Judaism. Although misguided as they are, and reform and conservative Judaism and their ceremonies when it comes to chasanas do not match up with what the halachic qualifications and needs for a Jewish wedding are. But afal pikin, these are people who are somewhat shtelling to a Jewish system. So how do you look at them? Do you say this goes into the old shaila of civil marriages that Rav Chaim Ozer and the Dvar Avram and other great poskim of record of note paskin on already, or do you say this is a brand new shaila? Now Rav Henkin, in his sefer, I believe Pirusha Ivra, he writes over there, this was a shaila that was common in America in the early days, in the 40s and the 50s. Rav Henkin writes that since these people are trying to do some sort of religious marriage, and even more so than that, he introduces a new svara, and he brings rayas to this, and we won't go into this in detail, but he introduces a new svara, that just the idea of them agreeing to live chaye ish v'isha, to try to live a normal married life, a monogamous, married relationship, that itself constitutes a desire to be married. And since these people are showing a desire to be married, aside from a religious standpoint on some level, and certainly from a reality standpoint, because they're committing to live this monogamous, marriage lifestyle, therefore we say, and in the Maisa Bilas Bilas Nos, and it constitutes a marriage, pro forma, even though they didn't, openly express the desire to have this marriage, it constitutes a marriage on its own, and these people need a get. And the nafkamina is tremendous nafkaminas. There were thousands and thousands of these marriages that were taking place in America in the time. And should one of these marriages dissolve without a get, the man is not able to be married again, the woman's not able to be married again, and if the woman gets married again, she produces mamzerim. The ramifications of the shaila were tremendous. And this is Rav Hinkin's Psach l'Chumra. Now comes along Rav Moshe, and Chelik Evan of Even Ezer, early in Rav Moshe's Tshuvas career, and Rav Moshe writes that he believes that this is no different than the shaila of the Dvar Avram, and the Rivash, and Rav Chaim Ozer, and therefore, according to what seems to be a halachic pshuta that the Mechaber and the Ramah both agree with, based on this Rivash, there's no reason to treat these marriages as serious. These are people who are, so to speak, explicitly precluding themselves from a religious marriage. They're lahedya saying, we want no chelik in an Orthodox marriage. We want to get married only, conservative reform. We don't want a Jewish marriage at all. And and additionally they're living in violating much more Isurim Chamurim, and therefore says Rav Moshe, this is not considered a marriage. They do not need a get. And although Rav Moshe concedes that l'chatchila would be nice to get a get for them, but in the event that they do not have a get, the children are not mamzerim and they have nothing to worry about. And with this one fell swoop, Rav Moshe was matir and saved, probably potentially tens of thousands of cases of potential mamzeris. By now, it's got to be much more than that. It's got to be hundreds of thousands of cases of potential mamzeris. And this is a tremendous, kula that Rav Moshe, inserted into the discussion about these marriages. Now, what's interesting is that this really goes to the heart of how Rav Moshe looked at conservative and reform. And I think we spoke about this at a different time, and I'm not going to go into it now, but there's many tshuvas in regards to many different halacha shaylas, where you see that Rav Moshe's outlook towards the reform, and even the conservative movement, which at that point was still somewhat conservadox. There was still some orthodox tendencies amongst the conservative movement. Rav Moshe certainly felt that they needed to be looked at and treated, and he did treat them in Gansen as removed from the body politic of Judaism. He did not see them as part of the Orthodox community or part of the Jewish community of Bichlal in any way that halacha was negayah to them. And this is another example of that, but we're not going to go into that now. This is Rav Moshe's psak. Now, when Rav Henkin heard of this psak, Rav Henkin was devastated. He really, really, really did not like this psak. He sent messages to Rav Moshe, telling Rav Moshe that this psak is not acceptable, and it needs to be taken back, and this can't be, and he brought rayas and proofs, and Rav Moshe wrote on this inyan many times over his career as a Meshiv, always sticking to his psak, even at sometimes implying that Rav Henkin agreed with him to a certain degree, although Rav Henkin, in his writings never seemed to imply that, and Rav Henkin's great grandson, the Shelas Shuvas B'nai Banim and Chelik Beis, is almost like infuriated and frustrated by the fact that Rav Moshe seems to still be including Rav Henkin in some of these psak, when Rav Henkin was clearly against them. But putting that aside, I want to read from you a little bit. Rav Henkin published this in Apardes. It was later published again in Tshuvas Ivra, when they collected Rav Henkin's writings. But he wrote, some of the harshest terminology in the Apardes in Nisan Tafshin Chav Gimel. It's on the 5th page actually, if someone wants to look it up. He writes as follows. He says, "L'tzayri mucher chani liyas bal macha al hirasa benidin nisui arkayis reform." Unfortunately, he says, although this goes against my grain and I don't want to be doing this, I need to be a bal macha, a protester against what Rav Moshe is paskening over here in regards to this to this din of these civil marriages and reform marriages. He says, "V'lu haya psak bal peh." If Rav Moshe just would have given this psak bal peh, Pella Eisen, and not published it and not wrote it, and you see this interesting, Rav Henkin seemed to have felt the better way to give a controversial psak is to do it, quietly and on the down low, and don't make a big thing about it. Don't reveal all your reasonings. Don't talk about it too much. Rav Henkin was suggesting, "Luhei psak bal peh hecharashti." If it would have been just a side, quiet psak that he gave to someone on the side, I would have been quiet. Kima koichi av mekivan she'adavar ba b'sefer umakla yagidloi. Since it's in his sefer and now it's established for time immemorial, and he argued with what I wrote, my earlier psak al chumra in Pirush Ivra. He says, I have to be chayzer, I have to be review what I said and quiet to him, and I have to be meich on this and show that I don't agree with this, lest people come to believe that I agree with him, at all in this matter. And Rav Henkin writes further in that letter, he says, Rav Moshe is mechuyev to write a chazara, a retraction, so that people shouldn't be samech on his psak. Ki kol hayra b'zeh averihi v'yatzal ma'ashev shel hatzal. Whatever he could save by being chayzer should be chayzer. B'tzar miyochad, he says, amasha ula yigram b'chtav yitzar lahadar go'inoi. Av melech hashemayim yad kol hashayner. Rav Henkin writes that although I need to, it pains me greatly to think that I'm going to cause Rav Moshe pain. Even amongst the dispute and the disagreement, you see the tremendous love and respect that they had for each other. He says, it pains me to think that what I'm going to do is going to cause pain to Rav Moshe, but what can I do? Malach Shemayim, I need to be Meicha. Now, Rav Henkin writes elsewhere that he first tried to send Rav Moshe messages privately, and that Rav Moshe refused to back down. Rav Moshe wasn't geiris them. He didn't change his mind. And only when his back was to the wall and he felt like he had no way to make his point be heard and to show that he was not on board for this, he had to publish this broadside to argue on Rav Henkin, and he argued on Rav Moshe, and he argued Rav Moshe extremely strongly. Now, Lamaisa, Rabbi Yashiv, and I know Rav Scheinberg says this, and many other places. I know the Rabbanot in Eretz Yisrael, and Rav Herzog has a tshuva about it, and others all agree with Rav Moshe that this does not constitute a marriage, and therefore these are not considered mamzerim. And this psak of Rav Moshe, I would say by and large, became enshrined in the world of psak as the go-to way of looking at these marriages. And over time, as these couples, let's say, these unreligious couples who were getting married in conservative and reform ceremonies, became more and more distant from any shemitz of orthodoxy, and they were doing these ceremonies just as some sort of throwback to honor grandma or grandpa or whatever. So Rav Moshe's psak gained more and more validity, from the reality on the ground, and we could say, I guess the world of psak never really looked back from this. Meaning, this became the go-to psak on the shaila. Now, Rav Henkin, until his dying day, according to the testimony of his Einikel in Bnei Banim Chelik Bey's Tshuva Lamed Ches, insists that he was never taken by this psak, always was against it, and always wished that Rav Moshe would walk it back. But alas, that was not meant to be. And this is just an example of the few occurrences where Rav Henkin and Rav Moshe had strong disagreements with each other. Although by and large, anybody who knew them or operated in their circle, and even amongst their own writings, you see the tremendous love and respect that these two giants of psak, each one in their own way, had for each other. Now, just not to leave the page empty, there's one more. You could say it's almost inconsequential, but a fascinating tshuva from Rav Henkin that is essentially another machlokes between Rav Moshe and Rav Henkin about a much, much less consequential matter that I just want to share once we're on the Inyan. I've talked in the past about this tshuva. Rav Moshe has a tshuva in Siman Ayin Zayin in Chesh Mishpat, where he handles if it's permitted to sue the British government in like The Hague, the international courts, for not providing funding to Jewish schools. Now, it's a short tshuva, and Rav Moshe writes that he originally didn't really think that there should be much of a shaila. He says, of course, you could pursue the government to provide the necessary funding that it's obligated to provide. But then Rav Moshe continues on. He says, now I understand the question a little better. He says, your question is, if you could make a big, splash in the media and sue the British government outside of Britain, in international courts, to compel them to not be anti-Semitic and to honor their obligations. That Rav Moshe, in a short tshuva, he says that the idea of Eva and not rating on, our Goyish neighbors is a big concern. And you see how much Chazal, bent backwards to not create Eva. And therefore he says to be very cautious about something like this. And then he ends off with an interesting thing. He brings what other Achronim say. I believe the Maratzchias says in his own way, and other Achronim say it in their own way. The Aruch LaNer maybe, the Maratzchias, but he brings that Rashi in Chumash and Parshas Vayishlach brings a famous pasuk, Halacha hi b'yadua she'esav saynu liyakov. Right? Rashi brings, I think it's Sifri, that Halacha hi b'yadua she'esav saynu liyakov. Says Rav Moshe, what that means to tell us why choose the word halacha, and I think other Achronim say this as well, is because halacha is immutable. Halacha doesn't change. So halacha b'yadua esav saynu liyakov is meaning even if the facts on the ground don't seem to match that, and you don't seem to see any hate from the goyim, and it seems like times are good and we could be treated as equals, halacha b'yadua esav saynu liyakov, you have to presume that goyim, deep down, the non-Jewish world, is not your friend and does not want to see your hatzlacha, and therefore even if everything seems okay, you have to be super cautious not to make, sue them or do something like this, bring them to an international court, which could cause tremendous animosity. You have to be very careful of doing something like that. That's what Moshe says. Now, what's interesting is that Rav Henkin, I don't know that I would say it's directly in response, but I have seen it framed that way, but l'chayr it's not. But Rav Henkin in Tshuva Sivra, in Siman Kuf Tazayin, close to the end of the Sefer, he has an entire tshuva about the concept of halacha b'yadua esav saynu liyakov, about the idea of goyim hating Jews, and he has a whole different take on it. Now, ultimately, I think he too agrees that doing things that aggravate and would upset the host nation is not wise for a Jewish population. He would be against it as well. But he has a whole different take on the idea of esav saynu liyakov. He says halacha b'yadua esav saynu liyakov does not mean that there can never be good times. And instead, he turns the focus inward and says that Jews have to be much, much more conscious of their own behavior, because that's what causes sinas Yisrael. What causes, anti-Semitism and hate for Jews is primarily Jews' own behavior. Now, he brings 4 or 5 different components that he says Jews need to be more cautious about, not to increase the hate against them. And some of these things resonate tremendously. So I think that they're worth sharing. Now, before I go into the tshuva, I just wanted to share one interesting thing. There's a Gemara in Moed Katan on Daf Chavav. That's a fascinating Gemara to me. The Gemara is talking about the specific occurrences of tsaras that befell Klal Yisrael, And then in the conversation there, it brings an interesting conversation that Shvor Malka, King Shapur, had with Shmuel, the Amira. And it says, Umi Katal Shvor Malka Yehudai, it's Gemara in Moed Katan Chavav Amud Aleph. It says, did Shvor Malka, King Shvor Malka, ever kill Jews? I have ha'amar le Shvor Malka le Shmuel. Did Shvor Malka not tell Shmuel, Teisi le Lekat le Yehudim Yolam? I deserve credit, I should get schar because I never killed Jews. The Gemara answers, no, Hasam inu garmi lenafshayu. The occurrence that we know on the record of Shapur, King Shapur, Shvor Malka, killing Jews, was Garmi and Afshayu. They caused it to themselves. And the Gemara later tells us why. Because they were joyful when there was a rebellion. They, so to speak, participated, at least in spirit, in a rebellion against King Shapur. And therefore the fact that King Shapur massacred, it sounds like in the Gemara, thousands, maybe tens of thousands of them, was somewhat justifiable. He was still able to claim to Shmuel that I deserve credit for never killing a Jew needlessly, never killing a Jew just out of spite. So, to me, this Gemara itself, this Gemara Moed Katan, seems to highlight this Nakuda, that although halacha b'yidu eitz of Seinu Li'Yaakov, and a certain amount of the animosity and the hate, the animus that Goyim have towards Jews, is a pre-existing condition, and we need to take it in stride. There are certain amounts of it, maybe even great amounts of it, maybe even the bulk of it, that Jews themselves, if they don't bear culpability, but at least have the ability to modify and to impact greatly. Meaning, maybe we can't say Jews are responsible for I'm not victim blaming, but Al Kapanim Jews can impact it. Now, I want to read you, this is not me talking, this is Rav Henkin talking, and I want to read you his tshuva that he gives a bunch of examples. He says, V'yarnu kama pa'amim, he says, Shafilu kishi Yisrael b'goyla, even when Klal Yisrael's in Galus, Yechaylim li is bracha la'atzmam v'gam lo'elam b'chlal. They could be a bracha for themselves and a bracha for the whole world. He says, how do you do that? They savlanas v'tzina, by walking humbly and being patient. He says, Im ta'ayin hativ, if you look closely, timtza sheroiv hatzaras, Higiyunu, Mishum Shalei Shamarnu, Yisrael the Seila. Most of the tzaras that befell Klal Yisrael, and he's writing this in the year Tafshin Chavches, 1968. Most of the tzaras that befell Klal Yisrael was because they didn't walk humbly amongst the nations. And he says, first thing he says is Am Yisrael, this is a beautiful piece, Mechunan B'Kishrein Gadol. Klal Yisrael is blessed with major kishreinis, Yosim B'Kalumas. We have tremendous talents. Hein B'Chachma V'Hein Lagila Oishev Afilu L'Gvuris and Mischaven L'Zeh. Says we have tremendous talents in regards to wisdom, in regard to wealth, and even in regard to military prowess, if we should dedicate our time to it. He's writing about, in 1968, after the 6-Day War, this was probably on his mind. He said, Hanasayin Hayrazeh, the reality has proven this out, has borne this out. It's impossible to deny this, that the Jewish nation has tremendous talents in all these regards. But he says, this tremendous kishron, these tremendous talents, cause tremendous jealousy amongst the Goyim, and from jealousy comes hate. He says, it needs tremendous wisdom, not just, high IQ, wisdom, to be able to ensure that these milas don't turn into chesrenis, he says. And he says, solution number one is, walk humbly. Don't have your successes be in everybody's eye. Try to do things quietly and humbly in a certain way. But then he says something fascinating. He says, I think this is so timely, so this is such a beautiful piece. He says, he says as follows, he says, he says, the fraye, they look with a bad eye on those who are sitting and learning the whole day. For sure, those who really, really dedicate themselves, they don't work at all. He said, this crowd, the full-time learner crowd, is just eating, eating for free, eating chesed. He says, the learning crowd, the full-time learning crowd, is doing a tremendous service to Klal Yisrael, even in Derech HaTeva. He says, of course, the schosim, but even B'derech HaTeva. Why? Because he says, Reiv halaimdim him bali kishron gedolim. This is a beautiful thing. Most of the people who are orangutan and learning full-time are big bali kishron. If they wouldn't be sitting and learning the whole day, they'd go become doctors and lawyers and scholars and scientists. They would cause a tremendous rise in anti-Semitism, because of course these learners, these full-time learners who are Bali Kishron, who are talented, who are capable, who would go out into the world, they'd conquer, they dominate, they do extremely well, and this would cause more hate. He says, so the Chafshiyim, those who are actually engaged in business and academia, in the world of the Goyim, should be thankful to the Eilim who's sitting on the sidelines, the full-time learners who are sitting on the sidelines, and not overdoing it with their success. Now, okay, this is just an amazing little side blurb. Then he continues and he says there's more things. Another thing is, he says, Kish Yisrael Maram Gvura. This is the Satmar part of it. When Klal Yisrael shows their strength, and this means military strength. When Klal Yisrael appears to be too strong, nations become concerned about them. He says it becomes the bechin of Havan Ischakme Pen Yarbid, like we see in Mitzrayim. And he says, Ezu Giber HaKovish is Yitzrei. Klal Yisrael has to have a little more patience and civility. When they come off as too strong, that also triggers anti-Semitism. He says the third one is wealth. When Klal Yisrael achieves major wealth, and other people, and they flaunt it, and other people are able to see it and notice it, that itself also causes tremendous anti-Semitism. And he says the fourth one is, and this one's a little more, dakistic. He says, when Klal Yisrael's mevaza isam, meaning, and this is very fascinating, he says, when a particular person from a particular nation does something against the Jews, and the Jews rush to say, all the Irish hate us, all the Italians hate us, all the, whatever hate us, that creates like a balkanization. It becomes us versus them, and that's marba anti-Semitism. He says sometimes, if you're patient with even those who hate you, you can turn them into those who love you, and there's no reason to jump to conclusions and brand whole nations as hating us. This is a very, very different type of tshuva than what you'll see in most, people who are writing about anti-Semitism, so to speak, or writing about these inyanim. But Rav Henkin over here is giving a very, very worldview, hands-on, description of Klal Yisrael and Galus, their ability to thrive and their ability to also, run into trouble. And although he's arguing in Ramesh in regards to the halach of Yedua, but overall, I think these tshuvas arrive at a similar outcome, that Jews need to be somewhat cautious in their interactions with the Goyim. And this is just a more innocuous, so to speak, location of somewhat of a machlekes and way of thinking between Rav Henkin and Ramesh. In any case, these are some examples of where they didn't see eye to eye, but I really just mean to use the exception to prove the rule. Even amongst the exception, Rav Moshe is writing beautifully about Rav Henkin. Rav Henkin's writing about his great concern for harming Rav Moshe's feelings. Rav Moshe by the Levaya is writing about the true love is talking about the true love they had for each other. And in the tens of other places that Rav Moshe quotes Rav Henkin, it's always with tremendous deference and derech eretz and kavod. And I'm just using this one time that they had a strong disagreement to highlight the rule. Okay, Yasher Kayach, to be continued.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.